The Russians are desperately trying to save their logistics in the south of Ukraine, while the Ukrainians want to build Patriot missiles. All this while rumors from a very unexpected source are emerging that Kirilo Budanov could possibly become the next commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. We want to talk about that, as well as the developments along the front, here in this situation report on the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians hit a Shadow Fleet tanker and an oil depot in Taganrog during their attacks. The oil terminal in Feodosia was also hit. At the same time, a hit on a fuel depot in Kurgan has been confirmed by the governor himself. In addition, the Saratov refinery has been filmed burning. And if we look at it, there are at least 2 fires. I suspect that it's a flare device for the gas. So not a fire that's unwanted, if you will. And then we would still have 2 fires, unless I'm mistaken here, and that's unusual for refineries. Unfortunately, I just don't know enough about that. But again, as I said, several fires are clearly visible at the refinery. In addition, an oil pumping station in Kirov was hit. So the attacks on the Russian oil industry continue, and accordingly, fuel exports will be suspended until the end of November. That is, until the beginning of December, in order to stabilize prices within Russia. At the same time, damage can be seen at the airport in Taganrog after the attack. For example, we can clearly see here how the building was leveled and the one next to it was directly damaged. And so there are heavy strikes by the Ukrainians in various places. The Ukrainians had attacked there with cruise missiles and drones. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians report an attack on a training camp of the brigade that was involved in Bucha, and I have this here at double speed so it doesn't take too long. Here again, we notice that the attacks are concentrated. We see that these are barracks buildings that were used here. And once again, they proceeded in a concentrated wave, so that in some cases, the impacts from previous attacks are still visible, as was just the case here. And right here is the next impact. And in this way, of course, the aim is to prevent the Russians from reacting quickly and to achieve a maximum effect. Furthermore, Brovdi, whose combat name is Magyar and who is the commander of the unmanned forces, reports that they have inflicted at least 31 casualties on the Russian side. Of course, I cannot verify this myself. We move on to the developments along the front, and I have nothing from Sumy. From Vovchansk, however, we have a report of a Russian infiltration at Kutori. At Vovchansky Kutori, which is here at, or Kutori, exactly like that. At Vovchansky Kutori, here to the east of it, that's directly east of Vovchansk, infiltration, but not advancing in any impressive way. But right here, on this side, and probably somewhat important, because it would be south of the river. Here, and of course, that would mean the Russians have at least temporarily managed to cross the river here successfully. As I said, infiltrations, unfortunately, no longer tell us anything about how the front is actually moving these days. At most, they show us a certain dynamic. A Ukrainian military spokesperson also says that the Russians are still trying to advance south in the Kharkiv region, and that there are many infiltrations happening along the border. We've discussed this multiple times, with examples here and here. We've had Russian troops here in various places who crossed the border and have established themselves in some areas. The whole thing is probably largely aimed at tying down and dispersing the Ukrainians in various places. That's all from the region. Our next report is from Kupiansk, and there we also have a geolocation of a Russian infiltration, which was spotted here in the north of Kupiansk, and that shows us that things are slowly moving south. Here too, it's too early to say that the Russians are recapturing Kupiansk, but the latest geolocations were here. I think a few days before that, it was a row of houses further north, and there was an attack about 3 weeks ago here in the cemetery. It shows, we see, they are slowly advancing south. If we expect that, it's not always just a few geolocations and statements. Unfortunately, it shows more of a trend than a fundamental change at this point. Then we have Kostyantin Mashovets, the Ukrainian analyst, who is very well informed, and he admits the loss of Pishchane. This is here in the east. The village was contested for a long time, and now, as we can see on the deep state map, about half of Pishchane is given to the Russians. Kostiantin Mashevets says that all of Piszczane is now in Russian hands, so we can assume that this is probably true, because he is a former colonel of the Ukrainian armed forces and has no reason to give false information here. At most, it would be a lack of information, but as I said, he is very well informed, so the Russians have probably taken Piszczane. He also says that they always try to split the bridgehead in two here, and are currently failing, also because they are unable to establish themselves there. But that's also an observation we've had here for a while, that the Russians are trying to completely isolate this bridgehead, to achieve battlefield isolation, and then to completely crush it. The successes they have in doing so are limited, but of course they still exist. Further south, we only have changes or reports again in the direction of Kostiantinivka. There are again a number of geolocations from the city itself, but I don't see anything new in any direction. In the last situation report, we already had Russian geolocations farther to the north, where the Russians managed to penetrate relatively deep into Kostiantinivka. At the same time, the Ukrainians are active in the south, so the city is in. How far the Ukrainians can reverse or secure this remains to be seen. But we have interesting geolocations elsewhere. Namely, here we have a Russian glide bomb attack on a bridge over the river in Drushkivka. Directly north and directly south of it, there is footage of a Russian drone flying under a bridge here. And at first, you wonder what it's doing there, and it's clearly looking for explosives. A fiber optic drone, we can see it flying along the entire bridge, then flying over here. I'll zoom in a bit. And up here, the pilot obviously realizes that something is being stored there. Yeah. And after that, there's the impact, and we see the flyover, showing that the bridge has collapsed. Of course, it's true that the Ukrainians are right to prepare the demolition of bridges, because we have to remember what happened in Kherson, where the Ukrainians did not prepare the demolition of the bridges over the Dnipro, and as a result, the Russians were able to cross the Dnipro with armored forces, simply over a bridge, and that would have been completely avoidable if, at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian side had prepared for the demolition of such important bridges, had destroyed these bridges, and here at the dam, for example, could have blown up the roadway. They could have sufficiently damaged the roadway, and thus could have prevented the crossing, with all the consequences and all the losses that occurred during the recapture. So, preparing a bridge behind the lines for demolition, especially when it is relatively close to the front line, it absolutely makes sense if we go back to what changed here. We have a bridge in total. It must have been about here, which means if we take the foremost point, it's 12 kilometers. Theoretically, a successful Russian mechanized attack could take place there and would have reached it in minutes. So of course, preparing such a bridge is important. Now we can see, of course, that the Russians use this to blow up bridges, and in this way, carry out battlefield isolation. So, to make it harder for the Ukrainians to resupply from the rear area. Who knows, maybe we'll soon see grids being installed on such bridges as well. Because preparing the demolition makes sense, but letting the enemy blow it up when you still need the bridge yourself absolutely does not. And that can be the consequence if the demolition is prepared and the enemy is able to target it specifically. In addition, we also have a geolocation in the south, or rather west, near Dovhadova Balka. West of Kostiantinivka, near Dovhadova Balka, we can see how a Russian position was spotted. Russian troops were seen in the northeast of the village itself, and that here at this location, the Russians are also active. Up to this point, they were present again. Infiltration doesn't necessarily mean control, but of course we can see that the intention here is also to bypass Kostiantinivka, to flank it, and then to cut it off. There are still Russian attempts there, even if they are not very successful at the moment. We've been talking about infiltrations in the region around Dobropilya recently. We can also see here that this contested area is now attributed to the Russians by the deep state map. And here we have a report from the Ukrainian side that the Russians are continuing to carry out infiltrations there. And for example, it's mentioned there that the Russians send 10 soldiers and then 2 survive. And of course, that means that here, if 10 people go, 1 or 2 manage to get through. Unfortunately, 1 or 2 succeed in advancing. If you keep sending enough from the Russian side, you'll eventually see small successes, which is what we're seeing in this region. This is probably no longer one of the core areas of Russian efforts, but even there, Russian advances are still taking place and are slowly succeeding. We've talked repeatedly about Rudinske, how the Ukrainians are slowly being pushed back there, and how the Russians are gradually eliminating the village. Southward, towards Huliaipol, we also have geolocated footage. Specifically, we have the Russians near the village of Vostvyshivka, right here at this spot. First, geolocated footage northeast of the village, and then we have geolocated footage in the village itself and on the way there from the east. That means, once again, only infiltrations here, so no permanent Russian presence there. But again, this is from 2 days, to put it that way. Mind you, that was over 2 days. Again, in the Vostvyshivka region, Russian soldiers are moving around as infiltrators. Most of the videos show them being engaged, and that is usually successful. And that's why we can't conclude from this that the village has already fallen. But we can see that the Russians are advancing further west, even if they probably haven't consolidated there yet. It's similar further south. There too we have a new position, namely in Sharivna. Here at this point, or rather not a position, but a new geolocated sighting. Russian soldiers have also been spotted here. Here as well, it's too soon to say the village has fallen. But it shows us that the Russians still have the initiative in the direction of Huliaipole and are continuing to advance there. However, that's not the case to the west of there, in the direction of Zaporizhia, even though I don't see any Ukrainian successes there at the moment. Then we have the report. A report from General Budanov, who believes that the war could be ended by the end of this year. We have that in several places here. So, in fact, General Budanov believes that the war can be ended this year, and that would fit with the expressed wishes that Trump wants to freeze the war by the end of the year, that he wants to end it by then. And that brings us to today's sponsor, which, as you can see, I use. And I actually only found both articles because I used Ground News. I simply used the filter for the war in Ukraine here and went through it, and that's where I found the different reports. And there we can, for example, see how many reported on it, and also which side of the political spectrum they come from. And there we can then look at this report. Trump wants to freeze the conflict until the end of the war. And there we see there are only 3 sources mentioned here, and they are not rated at all. They are so unknown, so small, so irrelevant, that they are not recognized by the rating system. Accordingly, we can of course ask ourselves how credible this story is. That's already a good indication, or maybe dismiss it as an opinion piece. But we see there that the rating is not as good. Here too, there are only a few sources reporting on it. But here, for example, we see that it comes from the Kyiv Independent, which is considered highly credible. They report here that Budanov says the war can be ended by the end of the year. And as I said, that's what I use. I use Ground News for that. Ground News itself collects such reports as an aggregator and provides them on their website. And then we can take the current top story here. For example, that Iran is stopping the negotiations. We see that it's being reported fairly evenly from both the right and the left. There are more right-leaning than left-leaning media recorded, and we can compare their credibility. Ownership matters. A report from Fars News, which is Iranian state-owned, should be assessed differently than one from another source. If it comes from other sources and the owner is known, it's mentioned here. We can also filter by political spectrum, left or right. Often you can see framing there, where one side interprets it completely differently than the other. And if that's not enough, there's also blind spot, where you can see what is largely ignored on the left or right of the political spectrum. So if you really want to be informed, you don't rely on just one source. But who has the time to read all the sources? Normally, you have your 1 or 2 daily newspapers, your handful of. And to be honest, those are usually the ones that are closest to your own political beliefs. But it's clear that this leads to not knowing everything you need to know. And that's where Ground News helps to overcome this. If you use the link in the description or the QR code, you can save 40% on the Vantage subscription. If you want to use it, I use it myself too. And as you can see, I actually use it for creating my videos as well. And of course, by doing so, you also support the channel at the same time. Let's continue on the left. Moving on from the ad, there are more videos of Ukrainian attacks on logistics. We also have numerous videos from the Ukrainian drone forces attacking vehicles. And we keep seeing tanker trucks being attacked here, which are a particularly valuable prize for the Ukrainians. And here they were deliberately targeted again. Even though there were different options, some of these have also been geolocated. For example, here we have an attack east of Luhansk, and that's already quite far in the rear area. If we consider that Luhansk is here, that means the attack was somewhere here at this spot, and thus 125 kilometers away from the front. And of course, such drones are not launched directly at the front, which shows us their range by now. We have another example as well. Here, there is now an attack south of Donetsk and another attack right here, directly east of Mariupol. That means the entire occupied Ukraine is now a high-value target. Is now within range of Ukrainian drones. Military informant, a Russian mill blogger, notes attacks on the checkpoints are now possible, even if Russia claims otherwise. Even if Russia claims that Donetsk and the annexed Ukrainian territories are part of the Russian Federation, are there still effective border controls between internationally recognized Russia and the territories that Russia has annexed from Ukraine? And these checkpoints, of course, often lead to lines of vehicles, which then promises especially rich pickings. Because on the Russian side, they especially want to check the cargo of vehicles, which delays the whole process. And that is likely to be very helpful to the Ukrainian drone pilots in the future. This is recognized here by the military informant. In addition, we have two majors who talk about it. The logistics at the front and the southern land corridor are constantly exposed to enemy drone attacks. They reach up to 200 kilometers into the country. This makes the transportation of military and civilian goods more difficult, and, combined with regular attacks on refineries and oil depots, has led to a fuel crisis in Crimea and other regions. Through the use of American AI-equipped drones and Starlink systems, the enemy has made traffic on the former roads in the hinterland significantly more difficult. Together with the countless tactical FPV drones directly in the combat zone, this has effectively led to a further stagnation of the Russian armed forces' summer offensive. So the summer offensive is not making any progress. Of course, we notice that at the front. Continuing with the quote, "Considering that medium-range drones like the Hornets can technically be controlled from anywhere in the world, and most of their components are manufactured outside the former Ukrainian SSR, that is, the Soviet Socialist Republic. Over there, they don't even refer to Ukraine as an independent state anymore. It's unlikely that attacks on a limited area of operations will change the situation. So, attacks on headquarters or factories won't achieve anything. Russian citizens haven't seen any real retaliation for anything yet, despite Dmitry Medvedev's repeated posts on social media. So even here, there's some muted criticism, if you will, of Medvedev, the Deputy Secretary of the National Security Council. Russia is now trying to reduce the impact. It is reported here that Atesh, the rebel group, the partisan group of the Crimean Tatars, reports that the trips are supposed to take place mainly at night and quickly. At the same time, with observers on board, a third man on board is there to watch for drones. But of course, this also means that limited resources are tied up, both in terms of equipment for detecting drones and in terms of personnel. Then, every military truck becomes unique. If you need an additional man, that's a man missing somewhere else. Driving at night, and that's part of it, will of course make the use of mines more effective, because they are harder to avoid. The Russians are currently still trying to interfere with the drone's AI through creative camouflage. It's still unclear whether this has any success. I'm also still waiting for the first videos where we see such a vehicle being attacked. Probably, as long as it's not proven on the Russian side that the camouflage doesn't work, it will continue to be used, probably out of desperation as well. In general, it is possible, at least to my knowledge, to confuse an AI with unknown patterns, but it's likely that this can be refined. And in addition, for example, the Hornet does a pre-selection, but in the end, the human takes over. And theoretically, of course, they can recognize that this is a military vehicle that's just painted in an interesting way. As I said, whether and to what extent this is effective is still unclear at this point. Then we have France again here, who say they have seized an oil tanker, a shadow fleet tanker. The question, of course, is always how long the tankers in Ukraine will remain in French hands. But that's another question. Then TASS made a very interesting announcement. TASS, mind you, is from the Russian side. And TASS says that Zelensky intends to dismiss the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, appoint Kirilo Budanov as commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces instead.
Der ukrainischen Streitkräfte zu machen.
That's an interesting source in this regard. And in general, Budanov is held in high regard, mainly due to his work in the Ukrainian military intelligence. How far he can translate that into leading the army itself is, of course, another question. That's a different task, but it shouldn't get any easier for the Russians because of it. Like I said, a very interesting source when we look at what this possible change in Ukrainian leadership means. Of course, it shouldn't be necessary to say this, but I'll say it anyway. That doesn't mean it's true, especially since it comes from this source. It could be nonsense, but it's still interesting. And then we have another article, which I found again through Ground News, by the way. Namely, Zelensky is asking the US for a license to produce Patriot missiles. So they want to build them themselves now. It's clear that Ukraine urgently needs these missiles. They have their own missile industry. So they are capable of producing missiles. But that doesn't mean they can just conjure up their own air defense missiles out of thin air. If they get permission from the American side to reproduce them, and maybe receive some components, they could start production. And the articles also mention and emphasize that this would also relieve the West. Because at some point, Ukraine might be able to supply air defense missiles to others. And at the same time, fewer missiles would have to be supplied to Ukraine by other nations. So overall, this should be a win-win for everyone, at least if the US agrees. Of course, that still remains to be seen. And then we also have a recording regarding the recent airstrikes. And there we see a Kh-101, a cruise missile, flying there and being hit and destroyed. And shortly after, an F-16 flies over it. This is an example of how Ukraine is now using the combat aircraft it deploys. In this case, it was probably shot down with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. So, a short-range air-to-air missile. And that's one less cruise missile that could have hit and destroyed a target in Ukraine. And that's one less cruise missile that could lead to civilian casualties or worse. And of course, it also means a military target can't be hit. That goes without saying. And that's it for today's Situation Report. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If you're new, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell. And that's all for now, from Torsten Heinrich. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. At this point, I would also like to give my special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Mahamuri, as well as Lieutenant Jans vom Eck, Uwe de Vren, Nickname Tabib, Karsten Schultz, Robert Veal, Vision Sound Soundlab, Lick Chatter, NTX, Master Painter Noggle, Marcus F., Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Sickwriter 666, Sickwriter 666, Mota 1000 Jonas Gu, Sasha Muller, Cunningham Eustress. Thank you very much. Without you, this would not be possible.